Hey everyone, Fearcrawler here. Welcome to the video. I hope you enjoyed this collection of short horror stories written by yours truly. To help with today's video, I'm joined by longtime collaborator and good friend Viidith22. I'll link his channel in the video description below. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and hold on tight.
The old farmhouse was barely visible through the dense snowfall blanketing the countryside. The dark van parked at the bottom of the hill, and the fresh footprints in the newly fallen snow told me everything I needed to know about what happened inside the house. I parked the police cruiser out of line of sight and followed the trail of footprints from the van, pausing only every few moments to make sure I wasn't being watched or followed. I had to be very careful. This situation was extremely delicate. The footprints lead straight to the storm cellar of the house. My sidearm felt like ice against my hand as I pulled it from the holster and tightened my grip on the handle. I nearly tripped on the crowbar, sitting in the snow next to the open cellar doors. I was fortunate enough to catch myself in time, just barely avoiding a tumble. I loitered momentarily at the top of the cellar steps and cocked my head slightly to the left so I could listen for movement. Just then, a muffled female scream assaulted my eardrums. I needed to move. Without even thinking, I rushed down the stairs and forced the door of the boiler room open. I was greeted to a scene of a lanky man in his mid-30s, armed with a meat cleaver. He was leaning over the bound and gagged female. The cleaver in his hand raised just above his wrists, as his other hand gripped her restraints. On the left side of the room, the small workbench was littered with the severed limbs that had spilled from the bloody tan potato sack resting on top of it. A few of the arms had landed on the floor, making for a gruesome sight. I cocked back the hammer of my pistol, identified myself as a police officer, and ordered him to drop the blade. He turned his head to look at me. He was horrified. His stringy hair, soaked in sweat, left a glistening trail on his brow. His t-shirt was soaked with perspiration. He shook violently as he gripped the cleaver with both hands, like a samurai sword, holding it out in front of him and challenging me to move. I knew he had no intention of dropping the weapon, and he was way too close for me to try and dodge if he had swung. I made one final request for him to drop his weapon before firing 2 rounds into his center mass. He collapsed to the cement floor like a bag of potting soil. I watched as the light drained from his eyes, leaving only a vacant and hollow stare of his face. By now, the woman was trying frantically to scream through the tape on her mouth. It was clear that she had never watched someone die before. It was a look I was all too familiar with. Her muffled cries were overwhelming and made my head swim, so much so that I had to go outside and bury my face in a handful of snow just before vomiting my breakfast. I returned to the woman and told her I'd be back as soon as I could. I made my way back to the van and found the keys still in the ignition. I drove it onto the property and parked it inside the barn next to the farmhouse. The driver had left his ID on the seat. I returned to the entrance of the cellar and picked up the crowbar I had tripped over earlier. I glanced over at the broken lock laying in the snow. I made my way back down the stairs and into the kill room. I knelt down in front of the woman and pulled the tape from her mouth. So many questions spilling from her lips. Why? Why are you doing this? I had a few questions of my own as I shoved the ID in her face. How did your brother find you? How did you manage to contact him? I didn't wait for her reply. I didn't need to. I taped her mouth back up and thanked her. You see, if her brother hadn't tracked her down and tried to free her, I'd have only had 2 arms to add to my sack. But now, I have 4. I made a real mess with the crowbar he dropped. Side note, I need to get that lock replaced on the cellar doors. I also need to ditch the van, along with the police cruiser. Just need to get the cop's body from the trunk first.
I'm a killer. I am a murderer. And this is my confession. I murdered my family. And I am not sorry. Not one bit. I bludgeoned them to death with a hammer. I hid the murder weapon under the front porch along with a bag filled with my bloody clothes. I took several items from the house as well as some money before breaking the glass on the front door and forcing it open to make it look like a robbery. I'm not saying this because I want to apologize. As I said before, I'm not sorry about what I did. I'm just tired of running, tired of hiding out. But I want to make one thing clear in my confession. They had it coming. They deserved every impact I made with the claw end of that hammer. And with every blow I dealt, I felt a piece of myself restored. I felt some sense of payback for the forgotten birthdays, the lame Christmases, the broken promises, and the ruined childhood. Maybe that sounds petty to you, but let me take you back a ways and tell you about my 11th birthday. That one hurt most of all. No cake, no cards, no presents. Both my parents went to work and left me home alone with the cats. But that's over. No more disappointments. No more letdowns. You still think it's petty? Crazy to murder your own flesh and blood because they forgot your birthday when you turned 11 years old? Maybe in a way you're right. Past is past. And it was a long time ago. Almost 6 months now. The story I'm about to tell you happened to me when I was about 10 years old. It was summertime, and since school was out, my parents thought it would be a good idea for me to spend some time with my grandfather up north. I was never really that close with either of my grandparents. My grandmother died when I was about 5 or 6, and I barely knew my grandfather. My parents thought this would be a good bonding experience, so this particular summer, they sent me to stay with him at his cabin. My grandfather was an avid fisherman, and his cabin was located right next to a lake. I had never gone fishing before, but I figured this was as good a time as any to learn. When my parents dropped me off, the first thing I noticed was my grandfather was outside, scrubbing the side of the cabin. There was some black stuff on the side of his cabin, and at first I thought maybe it was mold or something. The first interaction I had with him was hearing him swear. He didn't even say hi to me as I approached. He just kept scrubbing and cursing. I finally asked him what was going on, and he had said that some teenagers in the area had spray painted the side of his cabin a couple of nights before, and that he was just now getting around to cleaning it up. After he had finished, he took me inside so we could have breakfast. He asked me if I knew anything about fishing, and as I said earlier, I really didn't. I mean, I knew a little. I had seen people go fishing on TV and stuff, but I'd never actually done it myself. I explained all that to my grandfather, and he just kind of chuckled. He then patted me on the head and took me out to his boat. To my surprise, he had already packed up all the gear. Fishing poles, buckets, everything. There was even a small rod for me. So I guess I knew what the next few hours were going to consist of. After we got out onto the lake, and my grandfather had dropped the anchor, I asked him to show me how to bait my hook. This part is kind of strange. He gave me a very confused look for a moment, and then he smiled. I was puzzled by this at first. What happened next made me even more puzzled. He told me to just cast the hook into the water and wait. I did as he asked and watched as he did the same with his fishing pole. I asked again about the bait, and again he didn't respond. He just gave me a bit of a strange look. I then see him pull up a white bucket, something I assumed probably had night crawlers or minnows or something like that in it. But when he opened it up, the first thing I noticed was the horrible smell coming from it. It smelled like death. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. When he set the top of the bucket down, I noticed that it looked bloody. I guess he could see the concerned look on my face. He chuckled a little bit and just said, "It's fish guts." I asked what we were going to do with it. I watched him reach his bare hand into the bucket and start throwing handfuls of it into the water. Again, I didn't know anything about fishing, but even this seemed very odd. After he threw about 5 or 6 handfuls out, he rinsed his hand in the water and then told me to wait. We probably sat there a good hour or two with no activity, no bites, nothing. My grandfather looked disappointed. He let out a bit of a sigh and said something to the effect of, "Sorry, kid, I guess they're not biting today." He pulled the anchor up and we paddled back to shore. When we got back in the cabin, I asked him about the fish guts he was throwing in the water. He started to laugh, and he said he wanted to show me a video about fishing, and I said okay. I thought maybe he was going to show me some sort of documentary or fishing show, but it wasn't that. He put a VHS copy of the film Jaws into the VCR, and fast-forwarded the movie to a scene in which they're chumming the water. I was really shocked. This is the part where my naivety shows. I asked him if we were fishing for sharks, and he said no. There are no sharks in there. It's a lake. Sharks live in the ocean. I then asked what we were fishing for. He said, you know, the usual. Bluegills, things like that. Again, I had never gone fishing before, so I just took his word for it. That night, I hardly slept. By mistake, I ended up watching the movie Jaws with him, and it gave me horrible nightmares. But I really didn't know what else to do. He didn't have any board games or anything that kids could play, and Jaws appeared to be the only movie he owned. The TV also had horrible reception, and only things like local news would come in, but just barely. At some point during my night of insomnia, I got up for a drink of water. My grandfather was sound asleep at this point. After I poured myself a glass, I noticed there was a light coming from the basement. I was kind of curious to explore the cabin, and I didn't want to wake my grandfather up, so I slowly crept down the stairs to explore. There really wasn't much to see down there. There was only one freezer, and the rest of it looked like it was for storage. It was actually quite a bit of a mess. The one thing that almost immediately caught my attention was the bucket my grandfather had kept the fish guts in. It was sitting on the floor next to the freezer. I got a bit curious, so I walked over to it and opened the lid. It still smelled terrible, and it didn't look like he had rinsed it out yet. I figured that was enough exploring for the night, so I started making my way back up the stairs, when I slipped on something wet. I hit the concrete floor pretty hard. I think I even hit my head. I landed so hard that I saw stars for a moment. It was pretty loud too, and I was surprised my grandfather hadn't woken up from the commotion. I slowly picked myself back up, trying to regain my balance. At first I thought perhaps I'd slipped on some water coming from the freezer, and that maybe it was just leaking. But when I looked down at my pajama pants, not only were they soaked, but they were red. This really didn't freak me out that bad because I figured it was just fish guts from the freezer.
It probably would have been best if I would have just woken my grandfather and told him what was happening. But then I did something that I regret. I did something out of sheer curiosity, maybe even stupidity. It's something if I could go back, I would have stopped myself from doing. I went over and I opened the freezer. I was expecting to find chopped up fish or something like that. But that's not what I saw. Inside the freezer, at the bottom, was a slushy red mess, and what looked to be a human hand. There appeared to be some sort of tattoo on it, like a spider web or something, and the flesh itself was all bluish purple. I immediately got sick to my stomach and vomited on the floor. I immediately took off my pajama pants and started using them to clean up the vomit before sneaking outside and throwing them into the lake. I then made my way back into the house and laid on the couch and did my best to fall back asleep. The next morning when I awoke, I could hear my grandfather shuffling around in the basement. I was seriously freaking out at this point, and I was trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Why was there a hand in my grandfather's freezer? Whose hand was it? When my grandfather came upstairs, he asked me if I wanted breakfast, and I said no. I told him last night I had gotten really sick and that I thought I had the flu. My grandfather was in his early 70s at this point, and since older people tend to worry about their health, he immediately said, "Well, let me call your parents. I'll have them pick you up." The next 3 hours felt like a lifetime as I waited for my parents to arrive. As soon as they picked me up, I started crying and hugging them. They asked me if everything was okay and I said, "No, I'm extremely sick. Can we please just go back home?" For the next few weeks, all I can remember is being in an extreme state of panic and paranoia. I was convinced at that point that my grandfather had done something terrible, but I didn't know what to do. After a while, I just sort of wrote it off as my wild imagination, coupled with a lack of sleep, and spending time up north away from anything that I was familiar with. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried desperately to comfort myself with those thoughts, until I read a newspaper article that said something to the effect of 19-year-old man missing during road trip, police investigating disappearance. I looked at the guy's name, and the first thing I did was do a public records search on him. He had been fined multiple times for vandalism, including tagging places with graffiti. The thing that stood out the most to me was that he had a tattoo on his left hand, just like the hand I saw in the freezer. I never saw my grandfather again after the events that happened up north, and he passed away 3 years ago. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe it's just because I'm tired, and I really need to get some sleep.
Please leave a message after the tone.
I've been married for over 7 years now, and in all that time, my wife was a cheater. In the beginning, I was fairly oblivious to it, but after a while, I would catch small glimpses of evidence of it. Purchases on the credit card statements that didn't make sense. Phone calls from our house phone to numbers I didn't recognize. I would shrug it off at first, but after some time, she started getting sloppy, careless. Sometimes I would be coming home early from work unannounced, and I would see different men leaving the house. On at least one occasion, I even witnessed her handing him money and thanking him. It made me sick to my stomach to see it, but I kept my mouth shut and said nothing. I think she knew I had caught on, and for a few months, the cheating seemed to have stopped. Well, that is until today, when I came home and caught her in the act. Those revolting sounds of pleasure she was making as I stepped into the living room. That all too familiar noise as she slid it in and out of her mouth. The sticky filth of her disgusting act soiling her lips and chin as she eagerly swallowed. And then that look of instant panic when she turned her head and saw me standing there in complete disbelief. I told her I wanted a divorce, but she insisted I was overreacting. And then she started yelling. She actually blamed me for it. She said it was because I drove her to it. Because I didn't make her feel pretty. Because I never encouraged her. Because I spent too much time working. And that was when I snapped. And I strangled her. She's still laying there on the living room floor, surrounded by all those candy wrappers. She was always cheating that diet of hers.
After the birth of my son, I decided that whenever I was around him, I needed to do my very best to be a perfect father. What that meant was to try to shield him from the ugly realities of life. I made a promise to him, as well as myself, to only ever expose him to beautiful things, to show him that the world was a wonderful place, full of amazing stuff, not disgusting and grotesque things. I was also very mindful not to fill his head with imaginary things, stuff like the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. That might seem strange, but here's my logic. Those things are imaginary, and what it means is that if I told him a lie, when he got older, I would have to break his heart by telling him it was a lie, and I just couldn't bring myself to do that. Instead, I just encouraged him to be imaginative, to create those wonderful and exciting things for himself, and I was very lucky that my family was supportive. They never filled his head with things like the tooth fairy and stuff like that. But as soon as my son started kindergarten, that all changed. I would pick my son up from school and he'd be telling me about the Easter Bunny, or any other such character that coincided with the current upcoming holiday. Even though this frustrated me quite a bit, I figured it wasn't doing him any harm. After all, it wasn't me lying to him, and it's not like the kids were aware that they were lying either. They were just being misinformed by their parents, and since holidays are a fun thing, I actually thought it would be okay. But that all changed. My son made a new friend at school named Donovan. They were exactly the same age, and I guess maybe that's why they got along so well. Something about synchronicity and matching birthdays. I only met Donovan a handful of times when I picked my kid up from school. He seemed like a very nice boy, but something about him seemed kind of odd. He began telling my son about the Boogeyman. Again, I wasn't entirely keen with anyone filling my child's head with lies, but holiday mascots aside, I found this one to be particularly disturbing. Donovan began telling my son stories about the Boogeyman. Stories about how he would hide in your closet or under your bed, and if you were naughty, sometimes he would come out from his hiding spots and stand over your bed and watch you as you slept in the middle of the night. I kept trying to reassure my son that Donovan was just pulling his leg, and that it was just a story, complete make-believe. I tried to convince him for the better part of 4 weeks that there was no such thing as the Boogeyman. But since my son and Donovan got along so well, I couldn't convince my son otherwise. After all, Donovan wasn't technically lying to him. Someone else had filled his head with that nonsense. After a while, my son started having night terrors. Almost every single night, he would come into my room crying, his heart racing inside his tiny chest, complaining that there was something in his closet. He'd be absolutely terrified and 100% convinced that he had done something wrong and that the Boogeyman was waiting for him and going to hurt him. For the next several weeks, I did my best to put up with it. I really just wanted my kid to start sleeping in his own bed again and not be afraid, so I thought perhaps it would be a good idea if Donovan came over to have a sleepover with him. I met up with Donovan's dad at the school and spoke with him about having his son stay over for the night. I can't begin to tell you how relieved I was when I saw my son smile ear to ear at the mention of this. Donovan seemed to smile just as big, if not bigger, and they both seemed super excited about it. It was around 6 p.m. that night when Donovan's father dropped him off. I let him and my son play video games for a couple of hours while I watched TV in the other room. They were having a great time, and this made me super happy because I figured my son would just sort of wear himself out, and both of them would sleep through the night. I went to bed a little earlier than usual and told him not to stay up too late. At some point in the middle of the night, both my son and Donovan came into my room crying. I asked them what was going on and what was the matter, and they both told me the exact same thing. They said that they thought the Boogeyman was hiding in the closet, and that he was going to hurt them. I just wanted to ease their minds and hopefully get them back to bed, so I took them both back to my son's room, turned on all the lights, and showed them the inside of the closet. I even walked in and out of it a few times to show them there was nothing there, and therefore no reason to be afraid. At this point, my son went to get a drink of water from the bathroom, and Donovan said something to me that I found extremely disturbing. He told me that the reason he was so afraid that night was because right before his father dropped him off, he had told him that he needed to behave and not make any trouble. Donovan's father had told him that a string of recent murders inside the city had been done by the Boogeyman, and that if he didn't behave that night, the Boogeyman would be coming for him next. I tried very unsuccessfully to tell Donovan that there was no such thing as the Boogeyman, and how horrible I thought it was that his father would say something like that to him. But then Donovan said something very strange. He told me he had seen the Boogeyman a few nights earlier inside of his closet. He said this had happened on a night when he had accidentally broken a plate at dinner time. His father yelled at him and sent him to bed early. At some point during the night, Donovan woke up to the sound of his closet door opening. He said he saw a dark figure exit the closet and stand over his bed, making a strange raspy sound as it breathed. He said the face of this thing looked really grotesque and disfigured, like a damaged Halloween mask. I stayed up the rest of the night with both the boys, because at this point, they were too terrified to sleep, and I was way too frustrated with Donovan's father. It's not that I didn't believe what Donovan was telling me. I actually did. But I knew there had to be more to this story than what he was telling me. The next night, I called Donovan's father and invited him to the house for coffee. I sent my son to bed early so that we could talk without being interrupted. By the time he got to my house, he looked like he had already had a fair amount to drink. We started the conversation off by talking about sports and whatnot, just making small talk. What I really wanted to do was get a good sense of what type of father he was. Something in his mannerisms told me that he was abusive. I never saw any bruises or marks on Donovan's body, but to be honest, I hadn't really been looking for them. But I could definitely tell that there was some sort of emotional abuse happening. The more we talked, the more I started to detest this man. I then told him I wanted to talk to him about something that Donovan had said during the sleepover. I asked him point blank, "Have you been telling your son about the Boogeyman?" He said yes. "Haven't you ever told your son about that whenever he does something bad and you want him to behave?" I told him absolutely not. I would never do anything like that to my child, so how could you? He then told me about all the things Donovan had done, which, to be honest with you, I don't think merited what he was telling him. Not picking up toys, broken dishes, all things that kids are guilty of. Nothing that warrants being traumatized by their father. I then asked him about what Donovan had told me about seeing the boogeyman inside of his closet, and just how convinced he was of it. I asked him if he had let Donovan watch any scary movies or anything like that, to which he replied absolutely not. But he did admit something. He admitted that on that night that Donovan saw the boogeyman hiding in his closet, that it was actually him, dressed up in a Halloween mask and a black coat. He said he was just trying to teach his son a lesson, and that he really wasn't a bad parent for doing it. He tried to justify it by saying a lot of parents did things like that, and their kids turned out just fine. I then explained to him how concerned I was that my son had been hearing these things. I tried to reason with him and explain to him that we need to be raising our kids to see the world as a wonderful place, an exciting place, and we need to let kids be kids, not fill their heads with such horrible garbage. He, of course, got extremely defensive, which was to be expected. If the tables were turned, I probably would have gotten defensive as well. I put my cup of coffee down on the table, and then I said to him, "I need to ask you something else. In all this time you were playing the boogeyman, scaring your child like that, did you also tell your son that the boogeyman was responsible for all those murders that were happening inside the city?" I was a bit surprised when he chuckled at this. I didn't find it funny at all, but he seemed to. He said yes. I pretended to be the boogeyman. And yes, I told my son that the boogeyman was going around town and killing people that were misbehaving. Why is that such a bad thing? I then looked him square in the eye, and I told him the last words he would ever hear before I broke his neck. I don't like when people take credit for my work.